am joined this evening by Dr. Julius Garvey, the son of Dr. Marcus Garvey. Good evening, sir. Welcome to Talk of the Nation.
Good evening. Thank you so much.
We are also joined by Dr. Ellen Herman, an associate of the late Steve Biko. Good evening, Doctor, and welcome to Talk of the Nation.
Thank you very much.
And also we are joined by Wadhuva Kaumbi, the former chairperson of the Pan-African Center of Namibia, PACON. Good evening, Mr. Kaumbi, and welcome to Talk of the Nation.
Good evening, Hilda. Thanks for inviting me. Yes.
I'd like to start with you, Dr. Garvey, and ask you specifically, if we look at the idea of Pan-Africanism, what is it? How would you describe it?
Well, Pan-Africanism really is about African people getting together. And if you recognize when Pan-Africanism started, per se, this was in the first part of the 20th century. And the problem at that point in time was colonialism. So it has achieved significance in that we no longer have any colonial territories, either here in Africa or in the Caribbean, or in South America. You can consider Brazil now an African country, if you will. So that Pan-Africanism as a political movement, so to speak, has achieved significant progress. I think really where it has lacked is in terms of its own definition of itself as an ideology. You know, to me, Pan-Africanism is Garveyism, but you've really had many attempts to define it, all the way from Leopold Senghor and Amy Cizor with black negritude, you know, and then you had Kwame Nkrumah with consciencism, you know, and African socialism. You had Nyerere with the Jama, and you had Kaunda with African humanism, which was a sort of Christian version of African traditional being. And you have Ubuntu, you know, so the dialogue needs to be intense in terms of our intellectuals to help us define what the philosophical basis of Pan-Africanism is. And I think that there's been a lot of groping in the dark about that. And I think the reason for that is that we've been disconnected from our history, because Sheikh Anta Diop has told us we have to go back to our classic civilizations, and that is Nubia and Egypt. And our intellectuals have not brought that up to date because they've been fought tooth and nail by Europe, who's trying to appropriate our history. You see, as the earliest civilizations and so on, they're trying to say, well, it was Greece, and the Greeks didn't learn anything from Africa or the Near East, and of course that's not true. They learned from Africa, and it's recorded, etc., etc. So we have to recapture that history as our foundation, so that the history gives us the signpost, and then we modernize from that, because that gives us our values, and gives us traditionally how our societies were made up. And then we use that now as the basis for our modernization, not simply grab hold of where Europe is at the present time and say, okay, we're going to modernize in a European fashion. If we've done that, then we've lost the battle, because we'll always be pupils of Europeans.
This is very interesting, because one of the conversations, having celebrated Africa Day last week, one of the conversations I was able to listen to and to participate in was that there was an Africa that existed before colonialism. And that we seem to be defined only by the last 300 years of history. For example, the origins of modern medicine, the first writings, that type of environment, that type of history is not being told today, because we define ourselves strictly, exclusively, as if only the last 300 years mattered. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are in this regard.
Well, actually we have to go back a little further. The modern era is defined in the year 1400 by Europeans, because that's when they started leaving Europe and looking for wealth elsewhere. The other issue is that together with Nubia and with Egypt, there was the great kingdom of Zimbabwe. And Africans actually moved across the world. You find African evidence of Africans in India. You find evidence of Africans in Mexico. There's a book called They Came Before Columbus, The Evidence of Africans in Mexico by Ivan van Sertima. So the issue is our history is lost not only because it was usurped by Europeans and they defined what is valuable for us. Our history is also lost because we don't reference those great leaders of the past. So our leaders are only seen as 20th century leaders. There are no leaders of the Nama and the Herero and the and the Zulu, except Shaka, because Shaka is this caricature of Africa by the Europeans.
Yeah.
And so that long history must be reclaimed, and also a philosophical history has to be reclaimed. So if you look at the great storytellers of this part of the world, in South Africa, Credo Mutwa is one of those, whose writings are philosophical writings that explain African humanism, which is in fact the foundation stone of Garveyism. It's the foundation stone of black consciousness. It's a humanism. It's, although that's a sort of Christianized version, it says that Africans treat others well. And I suspect that may be part of the reason why we were colonized, because we tended to treat everybody well. And we should have actually been a little more aggressive when people came to take our lands. So I think that our history is a deeper history and connects both north and south. And sometimes we forget that the great buildings of Zimbabwe are part of that history, and they go back to 800-900 years. Final story, there's a group of people in South Africa called the Luvenda, and they are connected to biblical people because they were actually chased down the east coast of Africa by the Phoenicians. And if you look at the Luvenda, their language, their culture, and even their DNA is Middle Eastern, but they are Africans in the same way that you and I are Africans. So that's another thing that we have to think about.
We've been sidetracked.
Sorry.
Completely.
Sorry,
I will
didn't mean
admit.
to do that.
I'm fascinated by just what we've shared so far. And I'm tempted to ask you the question, Mr. Kaumbi, where do we start? Where do we begin to regain this conversation, this narrative, the history that we don't know about today?
Yes, to a certain extent, that conversation has already started.
Yeah.
I mean, he just mentioned some of the people who've written, like Professor Joe.
But how
Joe
do we
Ben,
mainstream it? How do we mainstream it?
Exactly. That's now the next thing now, is to say, and of course, because you see, it also got levels, you know, and the different phases. As you mentioned that, look, in the beginning of the last century, you know, most of the Pan-Africanist leaders were focusing on political liberation, which has been achieved. Now, from then on, of course, now it ushers in a new period now. Now it's about economic liberation and so forth. So it is continuing, and I think now, you were sharing with us earlier also that so your child, for instance, now is learning about Gavi, you know, something which we never did in our curriculum in Bantu education, for instance. So I think some of that is starting also with the school curriculum to bring in this sort of history. Zimbabwe is only our neighbor. It's not very far. We know about the Shanghai and the Mali civilizations, all of these civilizations in Africa, and our own civilizations as well, even here in Southern Africa. So our history stretches back, and the storytelling, and that is why I think that I know Dr. Gavi was talking about the philosophical part. And I think Dr. Hammond was also saying that the philosophy is there. Our view of the world is known. Maybe we need to just refine it and document it. And the problem is that I think sometimes we want to frame it in the same sort of format as, for instance, the European philosophy and so on. And that is why, for instance, the philosopher will say, no, but that is not philosophy because it doesn't conform to this and this and that. So, but we need to define it our own way. And I think people have tried. President Beki has tried with his African Renaissance. A lot of other people with African humanism of Kaunda and so forth. And even Namibia here with our president talking about Harambe. You know what I mean? These are all maybe isolated you know, concepts that need to be maybe mainstreamed, harmonized, brought together, and be, you know, converted into a, shall I say, a philosophy that is, that is coherent, and that will take us forward. But I think it is there, and I think what we are trying to do now, even in Southern Africa with the SADC, you know, the SADC, the Southern African Community, Eastern Community, I think the philosophy of trying to create Africa as one market, and also culturally, I think you were sharing the example of the founding president actually saying, ultimately the Namibian flag must wither away and must have only one flag, one currency. You know, so I think the ideas are there, they have been planted. It is now maybe for us to try and make them real, and I think part of this discussion also is also part of one way to try and popularize that. Maybe people coming to do that, and PACON, you know, which is sponsored this discussion. The idea was to do that also, to try and
help
people to understand that no, we as Africans are not the way we're defined by Jan van Riebeeck when he came here on these shores, but